This just want to
Hey everyone, welcome to the last panel for today. I'm Nadia, the Associate Director for Center for Middle East and North African Study. I want to start first by thanking Carrie and Max for giving us the opportunity to organize this panel. And I decided to read a bit so I don't get emotional. I would like to begin by acknowledging that when we initially conceived this panel, we couldn't foresee the new Nakba unfolding in Gaza, along with the escalated atrocity in the West Bank and throughout the Middle East. However, amidst these challenges, we were drawn to focus on cultural heritage as a main theme because it embodies a shared bond and a sense of belonging to a community. It served as a tangible representation of our history, identity, and our connection to the past, present, and future. Cultural heritage has evolved beyond tangible monuments to encompass a wide array of expression of human creativity and identity. From ancient manuscript to storytelling to modern-day landscapes, it all contributes to our collective narrative. However, it's crucial to recognize that while we strive to preserve the tangible and the intangible cultural heritage, the individuals who created or are connected to this heritage are of paramount importance. They do not only require protection, but also deserve avenues to lead dignified lives. So I would like first to introduce our speakers for today, and of course I mixed up the order. First, Dr. Murad Al-Sana is an adjunct professor at the American University. Prior, he served as a professor of public international law, international human rights law, and international humanitarian law. Dr. Al-Sana has published several academic articles and a book about the dispossession of Palestinian land rights in Israel. Before coming to academia, Dr. Al-Sana worked for more than 15 years with Al-Adala, the legal center for Palestinian rights in Israel, mainly advocating for the rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel. Shula Jan, my colleague and dear friend, is an anthropologist and an activist working with Syrian refugees and border populations at the Turkish-Syrian border, and currently works as an outreach coordinator and lecturer at the Center for Middle East and North Africa Study, and of course, Binghamton University. Shula has published various books and articles on anthropology of displacement, dispossession, and solidarity in the Middle East. Since the devastating earthquake that hit Turkey and Syria on February 6, 2023, Shula has been working on the issues of cultural heritage, human rights, and reconstruction. She's an advisor of Architecture Sans Frontier in the UK, Hatay Antakya Earthquake Solidarity Organization, and Collective Coordination Center in Turkey. Also, we have with us today Amar Azluz, who's a research fellow at the School of Geography and the Environment University of Oxford. He's a principal investigator of slow violence and the city, a research project that examines the impact of violence on the built environment at the time of war and peace. His research has been published by several platforms, including The Guardian, New York Times, and the New Statement. He's the author of Nomicide, Architecture, War, and Destruction of Home in Syria. And lastly, we have with us Tim Slade, filmmaker based in New York City. Tim Slade films have screened over 80 international film festivals and have been broadcasted in more than 50 countries. He has won Best Film and Audience Awards for his films, which include the feature documentary The Destruction of Memory, exploring the issue of cultural destruction, which has screened off officially for the UN, as well as Getty Museum and the Met. He had just completed a short documentary about a Holocaust survivor and her incredible connection to songs, and is working on a narrative feature film set in Bosnia and The Hague. So I guess, I'm sorry. I guess I'll start by asking, in which way the ongoing conflicts, or let's say crises in the Middle East, starting with military violence, disaster that result in displacement and the destruction of cultural heritage, to which level they unveil a pattern of cultural genocide, and how these actions specifically impact and affect communities. And if you can speak a bit, or if there is space a bit to speak about what are those strategies that could be employed so we could tackle these interconnected issues while we preserve cultural identity of Middle Easterns. To you, Murad.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Max and Kerry, for organizing this event and inviting us to contribute to this important conference. I would like to start to talk about the importance of the culture, the cultural heritage, through talking about the phenomenon of violence among the Arab Palestinians in Israel that have been taking place in recent years. So according to statistics, there is about 3,000 people, 3,500 people. The numbers are not accurate because the way they count also is disputed. But I would like to give some numbers here. So in 2020, there were 26 Palestinians who were killed as a result of the inter-community violence. This violence is not done by the police or by the military or through the occupation, but this violence is in between the people themselves that start to kill themselves, which is a very dangerous phenomenon. And as I mentioned, 2020, there were 96, 21, 126, 22, 155 people, and in 23, there were 244 people were killed. That means the numbers are increasing. What brought me to talk about these things, that in 2015, one of my friends, his name is Adam al-Hawashi, he was a lawyer working with us in several human rights, was killed in his home due to a dispute between two families that he was not involved in. So when we started to look back to the things and how these things, we were able to diagnose or to see many elements that play a role in this violence phenomena, like discrimination against the Arabs in Israel, the socioeconomic situation, gangs, and all these things. But one of the important things is related to the loss of the identity, the destruction of the Arab, and especially the Bedouins in the northern part, culture. And in this broad topic, we noticed that especially the legal system that they have been using was being destroyed in the late 20 or 30 years in Israel. At the same time, the access to the state legal system was not possible, especially because of their identity and their culture and the issues that they were trying to resolve in this legal system. I will talk more about these things after my friends get a chance to talk about.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's been great to listen to all these panels and really productive discussions. I think in relation to understanding cultural heritage, to the discussions over genocide, right, mass atrocity prevention, seems to be far-fetched at first. But what I want to engage with is, I think, first, the intentional destruction of cultural heritage is not independent from physical attacks on certain populations. And the second point is about temporality, right? The timing of those attacks on cultural heritage, which is we actually see the destruction of cultural heritage at times of peace, relatively, let's say. And what happens is that when we pay, the least attention, actually there is already in the cases of mass atrocity. What I'm trying to say is that we already see the start point of erasure of history and memory as far back than the actual atrocities happen, right? So what we are seeing, in the context of the Middle East right now, for example, Syria, Palestine, and Turkey, we see that moments of dispossession, displacement, moments of destruction of cultural heritage happened way before the actual attacks happened. So I'm going to give a specific example. For example, genocide is a good example in historical studies and historical anthropological studies. What we see is that the dispossession of Armenians starts way before than the actual genocide of the usual 1915 that we talk about as a landmark, right? So that's why I think it is, as an academic, I guess my point always is to try to historicize the genocide, the mass atrocity, and at the same time understanding how cultural destruction of cultural heritage can be seen maybe as an early warning that we have been talking about throughout the panels in this two-day conference, right? So I'll pose this also as a question to have this conversation with my colleagues and friends here too, because I think how important the destruction of memory is important, right, within the context of mass atrocity. So I'll stop here. We'll also try to talk about maybe how it is in the disaster context as well, but maybe a little later on. Okay.
Thank you so much for the invitation and for organizing this great event. And thanks for all the panelists for the great discussions. So I'm an architect by training, and whenever I tell people that I studied architecture, they say, what's the relationship between architecture and war? But since I started explaining to them that cities have been historically being divided, contested, fought, blown, and sieged, and I give examples about Hiroshima or Berlin or Warsaw or Beirut, they start to say, oh, I know this example, or I know about this destruction, or I know, and they start linking. Because many times when people think about architecture, they think about construction and about a new, let's say, future and about hope. But I feel we live in a time where one city after another is being destroyed, and the bulldozers are way faster than the destruction is way faster and more fierce than the construction and the reconstruction. And we see that at least in the last 15 years, beyond the cities that I gave examples from, like the last century, we see in the last 15 years at least many countries struggling with cities and wars, including Libya, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and Palestine. And even when these bulldozers have left the city, these cities are remaining in ruins and waiting for reconstruction yet to come. That hasn't been coming. So when we hear about any war, the wars become abstract and faceless, and then somehow they disconnect the people from their cities, and they turn into almost like abstract wars. When we see today, for instance, the wars that we see in the news, And therefore, I wanted to engage with this concept of domicide, which I brought the book with me, just to share here, which refers to the concept of the killing of home, and it comes from the word domus, which means home in Latin, and side similar to what we see in genocide or in suicide, for instance, is the killing. So domicide is the deliberate killing of home. And I think what we are seeing in cities around the world, that the city has become the site of destruction and the site of battlefield and contestation, that not only people are being killed and displaced, but also their architecture has been willfully destroyed for many reasons. One of them, for instance, is to collectively punish a community. And the book focuses, and my research focuses on Syria, where I'm from, and for those who aren't familiar with the country, the revolution started in 2011 with peaceful protest against the government, but they were faced with brutality. And I lived in a city for 6 months before leaving in November 2011 to the UK without being able to return. In these 13 years, more than 0.5% of the neighborhoods have been heavily destroyed, and around 25% of the neighborhoods have been partially destroyed. So the city is really like neighborhoods have been wiped out by the government and their allies, including mainly Russia and Iran and other countries. Even now, when the battles have stopped in my city, the city remains in ruins. And what we see that heritage, including mosques or churches or hammams or all the souks and old cities, have been willfully destroyed to destroy people's identity. But also we see a widespread of mass architecture, which is mainly people's homes. And today, the World Bank and the UN's published a report on the destruction of Gaza, to say that destruction has impacted almost every sector, including every university in Gaza Strip and many schools and hospitals. And they say like the largest impacted sector is housing. I think when we hear about wars and numbers, it's so important to not only think about monuments and monumental superstar, let's say celebrity-like monuments, but also to think about the mundane and the everyday life that is often forgotten. Maybe hand it to Tim.
I'll just add a couple of small things. I think one thing is it's interesting that Murad mentions legal systems, because I think, that in terms of what cultural heritage is or cultural identity, and therefore extending that to cultural genocide, I think things like legal systems, are part of that. And I think, sort of attacks on that are what we've seen in other countries, including Australia. Excuse me. The other thing I think, in terms of the Middle East perspective, which is what your question ended with, I think that, like, it's that particular context of the Middle East is complex because, of course, certainly to the West, like the perception is that conflict and destruction has gone on for so long in the region. And so I think it allows for things like cultural genocide to happen in a much more sort of hidden way, or where military necessity and things like that can be applied much more easily, because it's seen as being always in a constant state of conflict. So I think, I sort of think that's an interesting place to look at it from, in terms of they're cutting through to get to sort of identify cultural genocide is trickier, perhaps because people want to always reduce it to these interstate or ethnic conflicts. And I think we're seeing that play out, obviously, in Gaza. And I think because it's gone on for a long period of time, arguably like the Balkans perhaps was a similar context, but of course, at least in a concentrated period, it was, over that period in the early 90s. So, I think this perception in the Middle East has been in conflict for a long time and across borders is part of the difficulty of pinning down acts of cultural genocide and the true impact of it.
I guess I can circle back to Murad and then open the space for all of you to contribute. from your work, from your research, from your own personal experience, and everybody also experiences, how do you characterize how the legal system have been weaponized within Middle Eastern countries, states, and on the international arena and stage, and further impacted or further exacerbated the erasure of cultural identity or through cultural heritage issue, let's say.
So I know that in this panel there are two themes that are running, which is the physical, cultural sites destruction, which is houses and sites and all these things. And the other one, which is the non-physical, which is element of the culture that rarely people see, and including myself and my colleagues. So in Palestine, this destruction started in 1948. 80% of the Palestinians were evicted from their lands. 575 villages and towns were destroyed. And the people were thinking that we are leaving for 1 week. They took the keys of their homes with them, and until this day, they, in the demonstration, raised the keys to show that we want to return. And with this destruction, we thought that the conflict is mainly between the Palestinians and the Israelis at that time. We were shocking to see that this destruction of culture and identity destroyed our basic social norms and structures. So we are not ourselves. We started to eat ourselves, to kill ourselves. And these things started from the legal system that tried to eliminate everything that belongs to us. For example, this legal system said that this land is not your land. And also you are not allowed to do many things, and using the legal system for these things is one of the strong means of oppression against indigenous peoples, against minorities, against the others, okay? So for example, I have a good example here that when the state started to look at our lands or the Palestinian lands, we discovered that all our lands are Mawat land. That means a category of Ottoman land that is not private land, and you can never buy a title or an ownership in these lands. So that's why, for example, my family was evicted in 1948 to the borders of Jordan, but Jordan rejected to accept us. So we sat on the border for 6 months, and then we appealed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court let us go back to a different place. And then when we came back to our land, we discovered that the state is telling us that this is not your land anymore. And because the land is not yours, you are not allowed to build any houses there. And if you are not allowed to build any houses, you don't have schools, you don't have anything. So people live in these villages like before 200 years without running water, without electricity, without schools, without health service. All these things are done by law. So the legal system is used as an element to deprive you, to eliminate you, and to make sure that even your identity is gone. And part of these things is that people many times try to rely on their traditional legal system, the customary law that was making some order. But recently, with the changes and the displacement of the people and the mix between these families and between these societies, this legal system also was weakened and stopped working, especially with the fact that the land was dispossessed, and the land was the main thing that keeping people together. So the social order, especially for example, among the Bedouins, which is under the title of the tribe, was also destroyed. So the tribe in the past was in charge of the land, but the land is gone. So through the land, the tribe was giving you a job. That means you're allowed to give you a land to have herds and your camels and your sheep graze these territories. But now these things are gone. So with the destruction of the tribal system also the legal system that this tribe used to use in order to create social order was also destroyed. So if there is any conflict between two people now in the Negev, for example, people won't be able to go to the state legal system, especially if this dispute on land rights. Because if I have a dispute with, for example, Ammar in land, and we both go to the state court, the state will say that, oh, this is none of yours, of your land. So both of you will lose here, and the state will take the land. Okay? So we will not go there. We will go to our tribal judges or legal system. But we will discover that this legal system was almost destroyed and they will not solve the issue. And that's bring us to another level to conflict resolution, which is using violence against each other. Either I force Ammar to give me the land, or if he is stronger, he will force me to give him the land. And in this competition, somebody might have to kill the other guy, especially because there is a lot of weapons and smuggled illegal weapons and all these things. And that's part of the issue that goes into a lot of casualties and violence and killings between the Bedouins and the Arab community in Israel.
I just wanted to clarify that what state you're talking about.
So this is, I think it's a very important question. And the first thing that I was thinking about is also the land, right? So I think it is important also to just like clarify that, you know, when we talk about land and indigenous people's relationship to the land, and we know that from the American context very well too, that is heritage. So the way that we are talking about heritage is also a little bit problematic and confined in many ways. And critical heritage studies actually show us that, you know, how this intangible heritage is very much about that, you know, livelihoods that come with communal relationships, right? A community building and the practices all over the land and as such, right? So I think that's why the dispossession that comes with the land speaks a lot on the, you know, state's practices and political violence in different contexts. I'll get a little more specific with the understanding of this current trend of using certain legislation, so coming up with certain decrees to further dispossess, you know, certain marginalized communities. So since the last year, I have been working with, you know, I have been working in post-disaster contexts, and I wouldn't even say post, in kind of disaster context in southern Turkey, right? So I work with, you know, marginalized and minoritized communities in one of the cities in Turkey, which was part of Syria until 1939, and after 1939, Antakya became a part of Turkey, was annexed by Turkey, and with the people in them. So I'm also one of those, I know, Arab citizens of Turkey now, and part of that community. So with the earthquake in February 2023, the city of Antakya was almost entirely wiped out. You know, the death toll was devastating, but what I'm going to talk about is what happens afterwards in terms of dispossession and the, you know, Turkish state taking that moment of destruction as a strategy to dispossess people. First, one of the issues that was really big within the communities were that the Turkish government didn't act fast to actually rescue people. So it is very important to understand here that what it means when you think about a state not protecting or not searching and rescuing for its citizens in the context of disaster, right? This is a kind of, as I said, a side, you know, maybe topic in the discussions of genocide. But what happens, when you think about that, I mean, thousands of people who have been saved, but the state, the government decided not to act because they are disposable. So, just take a moment to think about that. And the second thing that happened was in November 2023, the Turkish government declared over 200 hectares of land as reserve areas. And they did that as part of urban transformation project, where these minoritized groups, such as Arab Alawis or Arab Christians, couldn't go back to their land, basically, to these reserve areas. The government came up with an excuse that, they will take these reserve areas and transform it. And then later on probably sell it. It's still negotiated, right? But it's certain that these communities cannot go back there unless they're able to afford or unless, they're allowed. So these displaced communities are now, completely, in danger of basically falling apart. And this is something that we're talking about when we're saying, destruction of cultural heritage, thinking outside the box, is that, the state is never saying that, oh, you cannot really perform this ritual, or you cannot, like maybe do certain things or come together, but it will find other tools, and most of the time, these are legal tools to further displace you or dispossess you. And that will definitely mean eventually eliminating that cultural identity, that heritage and that presence. So that's why it is very important to understand that when we talk about cultural heritage, we talk about people. We talk about something living and very, real, besides the building and, architecture and, built environment. So I'll stop here. And you'll have a moment.
Thanks a lot. So, in terms of domicide, I write in the book that it happens in time of peace between practice and in time of war. And in time of peace, we see it as like an everyday or slow violence that takes place across time. And we have seen destruction of architecture across different cities in the world, including, let's say, places in India where I have read a report recently about the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people forcibly evicted from their homes because their homes were labeled by the government as informal. And a similar pattern could be found in other places, including Egypt, for instance, where Dr. Omnia Khalil recently published a paper on how the government comes with these visions of modernizing and developing their cities on the expense of the poor, and where the poor communities are forcibly displaced from their homes because they are labeled by the government as informal. This process of slow violence accumulates across time, and they are like almost really like warning signs when we're talking about signs, and somehow they reach a point where we see this cinematic moment of destruction, mass destruction of cities, where a war or happens, for instance, like what we have seen in Syria. And what happened that not only cities have been destroyed for the government's label of military purposes, but also throughout the years of conflict, they started issuing new laws and new decrees specifically for housing and land and property, HLP rights. And they started legalizing the system of destruction, systematic destruction, by saying that these neighborhoods where these communities live and mostly are from, let's say, people who sympathize with the revolution and they oppose the government, their entire neighborhoods have been completely wiped out. Like nothing is left from them. If you look at satellite images, it's complete destruction. And this system was hand in hand with the mass destruction that happened across different cities, but they really wanted to create between brackets, legitimate reasons for destruction to cause more suffering for the people. So we have seen that in cities like Damascus, in Hama, in other cities, and then somehow the legal system has been weaponized to not only destroy people who left, or kill people or displace them, but also to have no place for these people to return to. So in the last 14 years, around 14 million Syrians have been displaced from their homes, In half of them is internally displaced people, IDPs, and the other half is in neighboring countries. But even when hopefully at some point there will be a time for people to return, many of them wouldn't have a place to return to. So that's how the legal system has been weaponized in the Syrian context.
Can I add something? So, I think that the idea that you're saying about informal villages in India is really similar to what we have in Israel, the unrecognized villages. That means you are not official villages, and that means your village is not planned, and you are subject for mass destruction. And they have been, it's not only destroying people's homes, but now they started to issue, now, 20 years ago, they started to issue a collective eviction for the whole village. And they will come and bulldoze the village and evict the people. And the irony is that it's not that they want to have land for those who were evicted or similar people or for like public park, but they started to plan villages for Jewish minority, which is a racial reason for destroying the villages for the Bedouins in the Negev.
Actually, yeah, I wanted to proceed with this conversation and maybe like touch up on the international, framework of it. Because I recognize when the conflict started in Syria, when it's come to, ancient cultural heritage and archaeological sites, the international community responded swiftly with so many initiatives, whether it's, through satellite imaging or documentation and thinking or brainstorming how we could do things on the ground within the confinement of the conflict. But when we look at the living cultural heritage, if any of you would like to add more towards like what do you think the response has been, how effective it has been, or if something more could be done.
I mean, to that, sort of to talk about what Amar looks at as well, is that I think in terms of international law, I think there's probably a couple of things. One, I suppose the best tool to help free things up is what I was mentioning before about the veto, because of course, in terms of Syria, was blocked, many times over the past couple of decades. And so I think, one main thing is to try to get justice for Syrians. And I think related to that is because there's a certain amount of evidence collected, right, by Syrians. And so it's sort of there ready to go. So that I think that, yes, the level of destruction of sort of monumental sites or sites that are valued by everyone is one thing, but yes, whether or not, say, the destruction of Aleppo or large parts of Aleppo in terms of herbicide could be, there could be justice there is another question. In terms of whatever exists, in terms of the existing legal frameworks. I know that the ICC recently have really developed their cultural heritage sort of approaches to cases, which is fantastic. But of course, with that, just before we started this, I checked, membership of the ICC is another big issue, and I think that all states should be signatories because this is about protecting international community, and so as well as big states like the US not being signatories, also I think it's just Jordan and Palestine who are signatories in the Middle East. So I think, in sort of getting to a point where governments will commit to signing these frameworks is important as well.
Sure.
So, unfortunately, from the international law perspective, during our long years of litigations for the rights of the Bedouins, not only in terms of cultural heritage and customary law and all these things. We were feeling that the international law is too weak. It doesn't have the tools to work in issues even more important. It's not even more, let's say, essential than these things. For example, the phenomena of house destruction for the Bedouins and the Palestinians, the evictions. So we approached it the different bodies of the United Nations. There was no serious act that was able to deter the state, for example, from evicting. There was a village called Aman Hiran in the Negev, and they submitted mass eviction orders. We litigated these cases in the Israeli courts for years. At the end, we lost because the state said that this land is the state land and people have to move from this place. And they evicted the whole village. There are several villages that they have the same orders right now, and they are planning to evict them too. So the short answer for this is international law sometimes it doesn't help in these issues, unfortunately.
Okay, I don't know how to put this, but without being very blunt, that is. But I think there is definitely a very problematic engagement by the international community when it comes to heritage sites that are recognized, very widely. With the Palmyra example, we saw that in the midst of a lot of killings. We were very much concerned about, ancient city structures. And that doesn't mean that they're not important. Definitely not, obviously, right? But at the same time, I see a pattern of just making it, and kind of deviating attention to those sites instead of talking about events that are suffering and actually working towards preventing and intervening. And we can talk about this more. I know there are, the intervention itself is a very problematic. It has a very problematic history in itself, but when it comes to heritage sites, at least we can mobilize more voices, and we can actually voice the concerns, but we are not actually looking at closely to the communities impacted by violence or destruction itself. So what I'm trying to say is, how is it that we're talking about a World Heritage Site so much when there are thousands or millions are dispossessed on a daily basis? Or when there's domicide on a daily basis through certain policies or through direct acts of violence. So of course, I'm very critical of this very, popular discourses on heritage sites. And there is definitely international law has cultural genocide within its act, right? The United Nations has a lot of issues about responsibility to protect those two, intangible heritage and tangible heritage in many ways. And I don't think it is functional. I'm going to be very, very direct about this. And what to be done about this is what I always write about on every platform is the direct action that we organize and advocacy that coming from us without relying on definitely what international law can, or is capable of doing. And that doesn't mean that it doesn't deserve any discussion or any work, and should be improved in many ways. But it doesn't come as a priority to me, because unless we have collective action towards that, there are no results to rehabilitate or to heal or to find solutions.
Maybe quickly, just to say that international powers or organizations have obsession with cultural heritage, especially ancient sites in Syria. And in Palmyra case, when ISIS, this Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, destroyed multiple sites of the ancient heritage, Vladimir Putin, of course, used the same stage as like a theater to send global messages to the Western world and to the world to say that Russia is here to in fact, like to be the guardian of heritage, to be the protector of heritage, to protect civilians and to preserve this heritage. And when they did this propaganda concert, they played Bach and they brought like they flew like sponsors to come with them. It was really a stage for him to show that he is like a key power in the region. And when I looked at the concert, there wasn't any speech in Arabic or anything. It was all in Russian, as if it's like a Russian territory. So it really shows how international organizations or powers or governments could abuse cultural heritage sites because they know the value of these stages, not only for the country where the site is, but also for global audiences. So it become heritage sites, cultural heritage become used and abused in these situations.
So I can go on and on about. I just want to highlight. Yeah, as an archaeologist who worked in Syria for over 15 years, I was surprised the other day to discover an article on Russian archaeological underwater excavation close to Latakia, the main coast city in Syria. So even the history of archaeological research shifted considerably and is disconnected from that long history which have been done for over 100 years in that part of the world. And now a new crew is coming to write the history of Syria, and it's something to think about. But that's a topic for a different panel. So let's maybe like for remaining time, let's talk about reconstruction, which could be seen as a double-edged sword. The idea of reconstruction is positive. It's like, yay, let's rebuild what have been destroyed. But for the case of Middle Eastern countries, I hope you could speak a bit about how also has been contributing to the erasure of cultural identity in many places around the Middle East. I don't know, like I'll open it to whoever wanna start first.
I think it's an enormous issue, and I think we saw it, just to talk about Aleppo again. We've seen that in Aleppo, where I think during destruction there were already contracts being handed out by Assad to I guess international companies and others of how to reconstruct Aleppo, which has a number of purposes. One is, I think, to cover over evidence. One is to transform the space, and one is to change the city into his version of it. And I think we're already seeing talk of this in coastal parts of Gaza as well, which is very disturbing. So I think, I think in that way reconstruction can be really problematic, and certainly there's this weird sort of this weird thing between the reconstruction and the destruction, where it's a continuation of it.
I interviewed once an academic in Cambridge University. Her name is Dr. Nadia, and she wrote an incredible book called Reconstructing Spain at the Time of Franco regime. And she told me in the interviews that there are so many re's in the reconstruction, and she said like the reconstruction should be deconstructed. So I always think about deconstructing the word reconstruction, and that the word reconstruction, it's about rewriting the history, reconstructing the economy, reconstructing the physical cultural heritage, reconstructing the neighborhood, and reconstructing the social networks of the connections of the people. So I think reconstruction can be also a landscape of contestation and struggle, and the landscape of violence, where the people in power, in the case of to escape from the MENA region, but to talk about Spain, at that time of Franco, he was creating his own vision of what reconstruction should look like, or what does the city have to look like. And I think there's also this concept of nowadays this concept termed as Dubaiization, which is following the Dubai model after destruction of a city to create this new ambitious city where tower blocks are emerging, and in that sense, new ways of destruction happen in the time of reconstruction. Two examples on this specific case on how could reconstruction be a redestruction of a city is Coventry in the UK in the 1940s when it was destroyed. And when they started rebuilding, they decided to destroy the city center or most of it because they thought, let's start with a fresh city. So the reconstruction itself destroyed more than the war time in the city center. And this was again the same in Beirut in the 1990s after the civil war, and it created almost like a luxurious, high design city center attracting investors, the wealthy, the tourists, and the elites, but not necessarily a space where an everyday person in the city would afford having a coffee there, because it's only for those who can afford that coffee. So reconstruction can be destructive and can be violent, but I think it can also bring radical hope. And I think many cities today, from Kharkiv and Mariupol to Gaza and Homs and Aleppo or Raqqa, many cities are waiting for reconstruction. And I think as academics and activists and researchers, we think about a lot about struggles and sadly depressing topics, but I think we also have to open spaces for a different kind of tomorrow and to think about tomorrow through the lens of reconstruction.
I just to echo that, I do think that reconstruction processes in many of those examples, including Turkey, currently in Syria, Beirut, in Lebanon. We see, we are experienced now, we see reconstruction processes being a continuity of destruction, right? Mostly it is further destruction in terms of what destruction of, ethnologist communities, right? Displacement, and sometimes we see it as a kind of democratic engineering, right? And in many ways it happens. And it works against this, indigenous peoples, where states usually kind of brand this as a moment of justification, or making these cities as or ancient towns, like museums, right, for the gaze of outsiders, and by displacing at the expense of local communities. So that's kind of like a story that we are very much familiar by now. But also, I think there is one thing that we need to address is the political economy of reconstruction. And that's often, seen, especially right now in the earthquake zone. What we're seeing is a very top-down approach where state, works with certain contractors that do not care about locality, about local contacts, about communities or community heritage at all. And we see kind of further destruction and really the environmental destruction as well. The ecologies are almost completely destroyed for the sake of reconstruction. So we see that there are a lot of actors involved in that as well, right? Of course, the state being the first actor, but also we see this very rich architects coming into the region who have never been to Aleppo or Antakya, or and then impose on this master plans of reconstruction and rebuilding, and talking about how many opportunities there are in those places, right? So I think, and it is most of the time, it is about really the economy and the profit that comes out of that. And I mean, I think in response to that, of course, it is important to see that there are a lot of efforts on the ground to reclaim memory itself and reclaim those spaces. But also, I think states are systematically using these moments of reconstruction to erase memory and, dehistoricize the communities. There are already campaigns on reconstruction of Gaza. It's out there talking about how we can use Gaza Street as a touristic destination. So I mean, it's appalling, but it is erasure. You know what I mean? So yeah, I'll stop.
I think who's paying for things is an important point, because there are certainly instances in Bosnia where reconstruction of mosques, if it was like Saudis, for example, were keen to pay for some of them, but they wanted them built in a Wahhabi style. And so therefore the Turkish government had to step in at certain times because, the traditional Ottoman architecture would be sort of approach. So I think it's interesting across borders, that sort of influence as well in reconstruction.
Yeah, I know this reminds me of a friend of, it's not a friend, it's somebody, I know his father, who was evicted from Palestine during the war in 1948. And he's now about 77 or 80. And he came to visit Palestine. He said, I want to see the village where I was evicted 75 years ago. And we said that this village is near Tel Aviv today. And I asked him, but many things changed. And they destroyed many of these villages. He said, I know where is my village, and I know exactly where is my home, and where is the well, and even the trees that I planted 70 years ago. So we went there and just to discover that, many Palestinian villages, the village was destroyed, and there's only 1 or 2 homes remain there, and it's not only destroyed, but they changed the name, and they built. It's not usually they plant trees like to create a forest there, but in that site, especially a village called Khiriya next to Tel Aviv, they made that one that a waste site for the whole Tel Aviv area. And from that waste site, the waste site started to call it Khiriya, after the name of the village. So everybody there knows that the Khiriya is not a Palestinian village, but it's a waste site. And this is very important, how to play with the terminology and the name and all these things that they were changed in Palestine after 1948. If you want to use that place, you have to change the name. If not, you change everything around it so people do not know about it, and this is the erasure of the memory of the people. So nothing exists and all these things. This is example for 575 villages, okay? And there is about 100 mosques, as I mentioned in the previous conversation, that are closed today, and nobody is allowed to use them as mosques. We had one case about the mosque in Beersheba that was closed in 1948, and they used it as a martial detention, a court for the military during that time, and then when stopped using it, they closed it. The mosque was standing. There's a very beautiful mosque was built during the Ottoman era, which includes a very beautiful architecture there. And later on, the building was abandoned, and the criminal people were using it to hide in it, and later even it was used by prostitutions to use it as a place. So the Muslims around the city were very offended, and they went there to clean the place. And they tried to pray on it. The police came and they arrested all of them, and then they brought the case to our organization to legally try to do something. We took the case to the Supreme Court. We litigated the case 10 years, okay? And at the end, they told us we can open it as a kindergarten, as a school, as a museum, as anything but not mosque, and not to give it back to the Palestinian community, because that would create a precedent that will force many other courts to return, okay, many of the mosques that they were, the 135 mosques that are closed today in Israel. So what I mean to say that there is a need for a political decision many times in these things, and this political decision inside Israel and between is not ripe yet because of the conflict that continue to go on, and people are so far from going through understanding each other or reconciliation process.
Thank you, Murad. Maybe we can take some questions.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It feels particularly heavy the time we're having it, but it's all the more needed. I wanted to share a quick anecdote before asking a question because particularly Shaul, to your point around the fetishization of how some international actors think about cultural heritage in the MENA region. In 2015, I was trying to advocate towards this, an all-party parliamentary group that exists in the United Kingdom. And it's an all-party group on the prevention of genocide and crimes against humanity. And it was chaired then by an MP called Robert Jenrick, who has since become one of our most anti-immigration representatives. But he then was chair of this group with a mandate on the prevention of genocide and crimes against humanity. And he did some activism, well, he did some political activity around the destruction of Palmyra. But when I went to speak to him to talk about the destruction of people, he said absolutely not. And the fact that even within that rubric of that mandate of that group, it just underlines the reality, I think, that it just struck and reminded me of that deeply inappropriate and kind of outrageous response to the violence. But I had a question, well, a couple of questions. One is, does the framework of the concept of the responsibility to rebuild, which, some years ago was sort of part of the conversations around the responsibility to protect, particularly around Libya, but not only. And I suppose I mean that both in a UN sphere of dialogue, but also just as a concept, as a principle of sort of a responsibility to help rebuild as part of recovery. Does that resonate? Does that literature kind of seem useful? Does that framing seem like a possible opportunity? And then perhaps more specifically on this point of reconstruction, and I'm more particularly struck by this point of the need, it needs to be holistic. It needs to be comprehensive. Do you have thoughts on what principles for reconstruction could be? And perhaps, I run an NGO in the Global North in London, and so my request would be what could those recommendations of principles be towards international actors, especially humanitarian donors? I think in Syria, perhaps more than anywhere, we have seen the profits of humanitarian aid go directly into the Assad family and the regime's networks for reconstruction of the regime's areas. And I'm just wondering if there are concrete recommendations that I could take back. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. That was wonderful. I have a quick practical answer to, especially starting from the second question, what international actors can do actually in this process, for rebuilding, for reconstruction. And thank you for asking that, because I think I've seen horrible examples where international actors impose certain, plans, reconstruction plans, and despite being very, uninformed about the dynamics at the local level. We see that in Egypt, we see that in Syria, we see that in Antakya in Turkey and elsewhere in Turkey as well. So, but I also, I work with ASF UK, which is the Architects Without Borders in the UK, and I think this is a good example of at least that practice. It's a small group; it's mostly doing advocacy, but I think it is important to understand that approach to reconstruction so that we can understand how international response can look like. So with ASF UK, what we're doing in Antakya is that, in principle, they do not engage any kind of building, right? Like actual act of building. They don't, they're architects, they are very, very well, within their expertise. They could go actually, make a neighborhood from scratch, right? They don't do that. And that's a statement on their end. They never work as an independent actor. They always work with the local actors as the leading of the projects. And in Sierra Leone, in Johannesburg, they did a great job with community-led planning. So what they do is they go and they actually have these long workshops and field work with the communities to understand their needs, their heritage, what matters to them, how they envision the future of the city or their neighborhood, right? And then move on with the instructions from the local actors, right? So I am advisor to them because I'm an earthquake survivor and I am from Antakya. That's why I have become their advisor in Turkey. So that's how they work. And these kind of international networks can become a powerful source for advocacy as well, right? To pressure certain actors, certain states. Well, to the ability that we can, of course, right? We always have limitations, and it's mostly about also funding, right? Because the global north doesn't fund us when we don't do what they want. But we do our best, basically. So I think this is a good kind of understanding of solidarity more than collaboration even. So, and also to understand the dynamics and, not making it about this powerful, actors dictating their imaginations over the cities. So I just wanted to touch on that real quick. So I'll stop here. I just want to share this.
You want to say something? Yes.
Thanks, Kate, for the question. I think just briefly is not to go assuming that an international organization has a predetermined agenda, which I think we see that in the UNESCO approach, that sometimes they think rebuilding a mosque or a bridge or a monument would bring people together and heal their trauma. And people are struggling with their daily bread, which maybe they want their home rebuilt before the mosque or the church or the museum. So I think even now when the war is still ongoing, the invasion of Russian invasion of Ukraine still ongoing, we see conversations, for instance, on reconstruction, including superstar architect William Foster. And I think good intentions are very important, but they can also be damaging. And I think the most essential thing for me is that in ensuring that every process of work on reconstruction does engage local communities, not only as people who are waiting to be supported, but also as co-creators of knowledge and collaborators and equal partners, not as somebody who is vulnerable and is waiting for the rich to come and help them. I think these are some, and I think economies are collapsing in war situations, so definitely the help is needed, but I think there are many moral and ethical conversations to be done about how to support each other as human beings. So thank you for the great question.
In terms of international cooperation and the building of memory and cultural preservation, one of the things that I often wonder is that what do you guys think when there is powerful dynamics with international funders on the things that they prioritize to be done in these interventions for preserving cultural heritage, when they do not take into account the actual community that they are trying to preserve the culture, because they are often seen as uneducated or ignorant in certain ways. So they prioritize some things like buildings, but there's also like communities that rely on oral heritage too, that enrich their culture. And I took the example of the Wayuu people in Guajira, Colombia, where they have been intervened, and they have a deeply mistrust of how government and international entities have tried to do this in the past, because they feel that it is not being done respectfully and they are not being portrayed accurately. And when I started working with them, the same international corporations told me that they were a very difficult community to go, and that I didn't know which water I was navigating. And I found a completely different picture once I got there and talked to them, and actually went there on an approach to listen to them and respect their culture instead of just trying to impose the way I do things. You know, what do you guys think about those power dynamics in between the international corporation who's trying to fund this kind of work versus the dynamics within the communities that they're trying to preserve?
Actually, I just want to add one thing in relation to Syria, if I may. I feel like, to answer part of your question, when you look at Syria, there is no political resolution to what had happened during the past 14 years. And as it was mentioned in yesterday's panel, the world moved on to the next crisis, and it seemed like most of the world is not impacted with what's going on in Syria now on the ground, and we feel like we are in this limbo when people are still oppressed, the political system is still repressive, and nothing has changed, minus the destruction of literally every major city in the country. And as you said, Ammar, people like starving to have a daily meal, and that's the reality that has been going on for 10 years. So
They forgot Syria.
they forgot Syria, literally. And how are we gonna talk about reconstructing Syria when there are still sanctions and the political system still going on, the oppression still going on, and nothing got changed? So I felt like from like the international community, so again, this is how I perceive it, felt like it's too complicated. So we moved on to the next thing, and people in Syria are still waiting. So I feel like any resolution or some relief of this horrific destruction of culture, of livelihood, of everything, it should find a way to reach the everyday Syrian who's struggling on a daily basis. And it's really hard, as you said, to reach Syrians when the system is like, blocking them from receiving help. Even like the simple help of rebuilding their houses. There are literally people living in rubble at the moment in Syria for the past 10 years. Sorry, I just wanted to add that.
I mean, just a couple of examples, I think. So UNESCO helped rebuild mausolea in Timbuktu in Mali. And that project was very much focused on the local community and how they should be rebuilt. And I think, I'm not sure about this, but I think because it was like a low cost project too, it was sort of, I think it served the purpose of seeming like it was, which it was, like collaboration with the community of how to rebuild them. But there wasn't large amounts of money involved. Whereas, of course, when you look at it was in Bamiyan, which thankfully that project hasn't happened, but it was sort of notorious for the countries who were going to be putting money in to sort of have a hand in how they would be rebuilt. Whereas consultation with the local Afghani people was sort of pushed aside. So I think, yeah, to your point, I think that happens a lot, or it can do. I think after, like, in the last sort of 7 or 8 years, I think there's more of a consciousness of this, I think. I may dispute this, but like, I think this awareness of that heritage is localized as much as the world World Heritage approach is sort of more accepted. So I think people who invest in heritage reconstruction are certainly more conscious of at least seeming to be consultative, I think. Sure,
Briefly, maybe just briefly, so we enable more time for questions, other questions. I think in a UK context, many academics have worked on the Syrian heritage because Syria was very fashionable conflict between brackets in comparison to Yemen or Libya, for instance. And also because they feel they can write about it without necessarily engaging with the local communities. And it became really like a trend that every university would say, oh, we're doing like this research project on heritage in Syria. They don't know the language, they have never been to the country, they don't talk to their local communities, they treat us as like unequal to them. And it's really disappointing to the point that I wrote about this on X, as they say, formerly known as Twitter. And people say, oh, I feel your pain from Argentina, or I feel your pain in Sudan, or I feel it in Lebanon, I feel it in, I don't know, in Morocco. And then following that tweet, I was asked to write a paper on it, like to unpack it, and I wrote a paper called Our Pain, the Heritage Project. And somehow it really impacts how people's suffering can be turned into an opportunity for some people who would use and abuse our pain and struggle for their own purposes. It could be in journalism, it could be in academia, it could be in actually in practice in reconstruction companies. I think I don't want to make it dark. I'm sure there is plenty of incredible work done by people who are from the community, and they bring so much hope and support and really like incredible amount of work done by artists or academics or journalists in a very ethical and moral way supporting black communities.
Can I say one thing to that? I think what was interesting, at a certain point, it became that the UK and the US couldn't spend money in Syria, right? I can't remember which year that was. And so all of that money went to Iraq because they couldn't be sending money into Syria.
In response to also, your question, I'm very disconcerted by these priorities that are set in the crisis, whether it be displacement or disaster or mass atrocity. Right now, we do talk about reconstruction, but it is also very abstract in the mind of local people who are actually suffering, right? And their basic needs are still not met. In the context of Turkey and Syria, there is immense infrastructural problems. There were already a lot of problems in Syria, and lack of infrastructure, and inequalities in terms of access to basic needs in the water. And then when it was hit by the earthquake, then it was another level because it was North Syria and southern Turkey. It impacted many cities, 11 cities in Turkey, and then 2 cities in major cities in Syria, right? So it added more complications in terms of access to needs, and because of the sanctions, international efforts couldn't be in Syria, right? And they were let in at some point in Turkey, but it was again problematic. Well, we can talk a lot about the kind of the politics of humanitarian efforts and aid and all of that, but at the same time, within the context of reconstruction, we are still missing humans. And even the discussion of going back to Kate's point, also like you are going to rebuild. We have to think about rebuilding, reconstructing what's intangible, right? Loss. After such a big loss, how do you think about what makes you you? How do you rebuild that, right? And this is the responsibility of all levels. As you said, there are, of course, different actors at local level, national level, international level, and most of the time there's a lot of red tape around this, and power dynamics never help. But at the same time, I think we are missing the point of, reconstruction is about protecting people, because if we are rebuilding a city, a neighborhood, a community, we need to talk about people being there also, right? Again, we're coming back to attachment to the land, attachment to those places. And when they are displaced and dispossessed, and people are gone, what are you rebuilding? What are you, okay, reconstruct and make it like this beautiful, architecture buildings. But what's the point?
Just want to ask a question in general to all of you regarding comment you just made, actually answering the question here, moving on to the next crisis. But my question is, what are your thoughts on referring to an issue or a conflict or a crisis and saying it's complicated and leaving it at that, knowing, especially, when just about any person would say, you know what, I wouldn't want to be in those conditions. I wouldn't want my children to be in those conditions, but it's complicated and complicated enough to let's put it on, put it aside as a way to basically exit the challenge of facing the responsibilities that we all have as an international community.
I don't know.
What, want to say something?
You want to say something?
Can you elaborate more? I didn't get the exact. Sorry.
It's about,
I think there's a tendency to just, whenever there's a challenge, for example, the challenges that you're talking about, making sure local people are involved, leading the charge, or even just simply listening to what the local people are saying, that, a lot of the international community will say, oh, that issue is complicated, and they're quick to move on to the next crisis. But at the end of the day, when everybody's looking at it, I wouldn't want to be in that situation. And none of the people saying that would want to be in that situation or want their children to be in that situation, but still say, oh, it's complicated, let's leave it at that. Or keep it very simple.
I've noticed, I think there's an age aspect to that too. And I think younger people like yourself and others I've talked to at this conference, I think younger people have to live longer in this world that we've created, which is not functioning very well. And so I think there's more of an investment to not say, we'll just push it aside. So I sort of think age is one thing. But yes, I think it's used too much as an excuse to not really examine something. And to not expect more of things like the United Nations or the international community. Yeah, I think it's very problematic to dismiss things as too hard, or that they'll always be the same. Yeah.
I think, it's an excellent point because it's just, I feel like though it's a can of worms where, we can all explode at this point in the last 5-10 minutes of the day because I think most of the time, complicated is a buzzword for saying that this is too messy and it actually requires direct action. So let me just, stay away. And this includes many actors, by the way. I'm not talking about individuals, but maybe from, non-governmental organizations to other states, which actually is very much related to what Kate was saying, responsibility to reveal, for example, might be an angle that we could, ask for. So I don't know if it is something that we can surmount and that we can deal with, but it is definitely worth to think about how these challenges are usually not dealt with because of the, political power and, and all those dynamics involved in there, right? So a lot of time, even in the UN context, it's the development of in certain states, upset them because of, other issues. I'm gonna get more specific. Turkey, for example, hosting the most population of refugees right now in the world, right? Or nearly 4 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. They cannot pressure the country on anything, right? Especially the EU, because Turkey might release the refugees on the European countries. We were talking about Colombia as a buffer zone right now because the US is just keeping the Venezuelans there, right? I mean, so let's talk about in politics, right? That political power and that kind of approach determines many things, right? Even though we have the will to change the status quo, even though we have, all these actors, practitioners, full of this room and others really trying to do something. But at the end of the day, that's the story, and that's what, it comes down to. And I know, and I want to go back to hope, but now it's like a dark picture. But to be honest, that's the reality that I'm seeing right now.
Hi, thank you for coming today, and I'm Ryan, I'm part of I-GMAP's master program. I wanted to mainly make a comment in that I saw a presentation a while ago where there was an NGO in Greece that had women of different ethnicities who were refugees all coming together and creating art, networking, getting together, which was a very excellent effort. And part of that presentation was a Palestinian girl who did something to like a crochet saying, I'm not a refugee, I am human. As if the implication is, because of how this international system is developed, I am not treated even as human, despite how everyone in this room would want a refugee to be treated as such, and rights that are not being respected by the international community. I wanted to ask in that comment if, in that reconstruction of these people's homes and people's lives, there is a chance for them to return to that status of being human that they're purposely being denied in many cases.
Yeah, I guess I'm fitting to answer that question. And the reason why I am a Palestinian Syrian refugee. I was born in Syria, born and raised, never seen Palestine. I hope one day I will, go and visit my village. Hopefully it's not a wasteland. I feel there, when you're born a refugee or when you live as a refugee, there are two homes. The home where I keep my shoes for me. The home that maybe sustain my life, and the home that even if I ever never get the chance to go back there, it will always be my ancestral home. And I guess from my humble perspective, I feel if there's a space for me where I could see myself among the community, whether it's local, national, international, that I'm meeting my needs. I can envision a place for my children and grandchildren, whether it's, again, the place where my ancestor left, or or the place that was destroyed from the war. I think that would be the first step to humanize us. Even if it's like a home that had been destroyed and it was rebuilt, but if it's a roof above our head, I think that will be the first step to humanize us.
Can I add on this? Or?
Sure.
I think like international organizations want to show the image of refugee as very weak and, showing them on the borders and, they haven't washed themselves for a few days and they are struggling. But I remember once in Bath where I was studying my PhD in the UK, a German friend of mine, she said, did you know that this woman is a refugee? I said, yeah. She said, she's so well dressed and she has an iPhone. Where from? I said, do you know that I'm also a refugee in the UK? And I think somehow her image of a refugee is about somebody who has nothing, and maybe people have arrived with nothing, but it doesn't mean they have nothing. They have so much, they bring so much culture, they bring so much love and hope and traditions and rituals, and I have been displaced for 13 years. I never was able to return to Syria since 2011. And I was a refugee in the UK. Now I have a beautiful community in the UK where I feel it's my second home, and I never felt unwelcome. I always felt very welcomed, and I always felt included, and I felt very safe all the time. And I felt I'm part of this community, and I now have a British citizenship. So I feel even though many people, I can fit all my life within a few bags until now, after 13 years, but I never felt I have nothing. And I think I always felt this ability to communicate and understand each other regardless of where we are from. It's been very nourishing and very beautiful.
Thank you, Ammar. You put it more eloquently than me. I was surprised by the question. I think we're out of time. One thanks panel. Again, thanks I-GMAP team for hosting us in the forum. And thank you so much.
Well, here we are at the end of another Frontiers of Prevention. Just a few things to say in closing. I guess the first thing to say is a kind of a troubling thing. It's a testament to how I think those of us who work in this community in these many capacities ride this emotional whipsaw between hope and fear and depression and discouragement, but also perseverance. I mean, a lot of you, maybe not a lot of you, but many of you were here last year for Frontiers of Prevention 2023. And I remember a lot of people, we had a lot of people whose phone alerts went off on the last day of the conference to learn of the outbreak of war in Sudan, whose consequences the international community is still dealing with, or mostly not dealing with, I have to say. A lot of people's phones just went off now to announce the ongoing attack of Iran on Israel, which is going to be unfolding, as we speak, and will be continuing to unfold in directions that we can't possibly predict over the next few hours. I'm not going to try to make some sort of comment or explain this sort of stuff, but just to say, hang in there, everybody, and we'll keep checking on what's going on. In the meantime, there's a lot of people to thank for being here. The first and foremost people to thank are you panelists, who have come, in many cases, great distances, being away from your families and friends and work for several days to kind of share your expertise and experience with us. We're deeply grateful, and we want to acknowledge the generosity that you've shown us over the last few days, and wish you safe home. And hope that we stay in touch and that we continue to work together and collaborate together over the next few years. I mean, one of the things that we always talk about at Frontiers of Prevention is how to make it not just one and done, because there have been so many interesting ideas and thoughts expressed over the last 2 days that it really seems a shame not to follow up on some of them. So please count on hearing from us over the next weeks to give you our thoughts and suggestions and ideas and requests for how to carry on some of the conversations that we've been having over the last 2 days. We have, it's not been a particularly easy year at I-GMAP, I would have to say, and a lot of people have stepped up and given us an extraordinary amount of help getting this conference together. They're not here now, but Laura Kipnis and Bailey Benninger in the Harvard Dean, in the Provost's office, have been utterly necessary. I really don't know, frankly, what we would have done without them. We have a bunch of grad students here who are just wonders, and they have been, even in ways that I don't think they always recognize, it's just, they've been logistically helpful, but they're also, it's just great to have them here. And so we want to thank them for being here, for being so engaged and passionate and energetic and curious. And it's just you guys being here is always makes us feel better. And we just look behind us and say, okay, they're there. So thank you. So thank you all. Carrie, do you want to?
I also just want to thank, we have some people here who are either past or present faculty fellows. This is a program that we really care a lot about at I-GMAP because it's faculty members from disciplines across the disciplinary spectrum. It started just at Binghamton University, and now it includes faculty members from 46 institutions across the United States, and we're really hoping to expand that globally very soon, who have committed to educating themselves and also becoming a part of the network and educating all of us about how we can all do better to incorporate atrocity prevention into whatever disciplines they're teaching. So this is not just people teaching political science or history, but people teaching nursing and theater and business and everything that you can possibly imagine. And we're so inspired by them taking this material, taking what they're engaging with here and incorporating it so that their students are also thinking about how when they graduate, they can become part of this community of people working to make this world a safer place, a more inclusive place, and a place where we're not seeing the kinds of violence that we're seeing right now. So thank you to all of you, faculty fellows, past and present, who continue to be a part of this community. And just to reiterate what Max said, you also don't just have to wait on us to reach out to you for follow-up. If any of you or any of your institutions think that I-GMAP can be a partner for you and we can work together on anything across the broad spectrum of what prevention means and the ways that we've been talking about prevention, please always feel free to reach out to us because we are here. It's our mission to be a partner in that work and the work that you all are doing, and we're so grateful for that. Anything else? Yes, so now after that heaviness, and also now we have some lightness outside. We have a closing reception outside. So we'd love to invite you all to continue this conversation just outside where we have some hors d'oeuvres and also we should have some wine, right? Yeah, all the more necessary. Thank you all so much.